What's shaking booktube? My name's Cam and welcome back to another video. Today's another writing video, where I chat about a certain genre. It was called On Writing, and then I realized that's already a thing, apparently. Then I changed it to a chat about blah blah, but to be honest, that kinda sounds boring as Ultimately I landed on So You're Writing, blank. I think I might stick with that one. I like that. I think it sounds a bit fun. It sounds almost like an aggressively mediocre talent show.
I have to tell you, that was possibly the worst writing I have ever read.
Oh yeah, alright mate, alright, take it easy. I did my best.
Oh, by the way, I recently hit 10,000 subscribers as well, which is pretty damn cool. When I started my channel in some of the first videos where I even mentioned subscriber goals, that kind of thing, 10,000 subscribers was what I would always say was what I considered a big goal. The goal that you don't think is completely out of reach, but would still be pretty crazy to get to. And that's finally happened after 3 years. So yeah, thank you, genuinely. That really means a lot to me.
Celebrate good times.
I will.
So what book genre am I actually chatting about today, you ask? Could it be romance? Maybe horror? Could it even be anthropomorphic erotica? It's time to take out the fedoras and foam swords, my guy, because today we're chatting about fantasy. On the topic of fantasy, today's video is just a chat about the things I like, the things I don't like, just some general musings on fantasy in general. I think it's really interesting that a very heavy majority of the writers that I've met in real life, that I've spoken to on authortube, they've either been inspired by fantasy to become a writer, or their first book, their debut, is a fantasy story. And when I say the majority, I really do mean the majority. I'm talking 9 out of 10, 19 out of 20 of the writers I talk to, they start with fantasy. I just think that's an interesting thing. Obviously it can be for a huge number of different reasons that could vary from writer to writer depending on their life experiences, blah blah blah. But I think at least one of my theories is that it seems fantasy in terms of writing fiction is almost the most grand flourish you can make. And what I mean is that a fantasy story, more so than any other genre in my opinion, includes almost every writing element. In almost all cases you're going to have stuff like romance, you're going to have stuff like suspense, maybe a slight bit of horror. Those are just some general common things you find in fiction. That's not even mentioning the more fantasy specific things like, extreme world building for one. And I think if there's anything that's going to ignite the creative spark in a writer, it makes sense that it would be a fantasy. Because like I said, we're being exposed to pretty much the full potential of a writer, at least in terms of their creativity and their imagination. But then of course on the flip side of that, unfortunately, you have a lot of newbie writers who start up with a grand project that is just completely beyond them, myself included. You get a new writer who comes up with just all these different creative ideas, and while some of them should probably be separated and used for their own story, we tend to just throw it all into one fantasy, and it just ends up being really jumbled, and almost always there's no actual thought put into how or why those certain things are included. You don't need to include every type of magical creature you've ever imagined into one fantasy story. You don't want to overwhelm the reader, of course. Although magical creatures is probably one of the things you can get away with most in a fantasy with overdoing it. You might not be so lucky with, let's say, you come up with all these different ideas for factions or gangs or fantasy organizations, and you put it all into one story, and then you end up with a really convoluted, just political shit show. I've seen it happen a lot. I've seen a lot of new writers throw all this stuff into the pot, basically like they're a tradie witch about to knock off on a Friday.
Yeah, chuck the frog legs in there too, mate. You know what? Throw the fucking lot in, mate. The pokies are calling me.
It's also really interesting that fantasy, because more often than not, and more likely than other genres, fantasy is going to be pretty damn long. Behind a Stephen King horror, fantasy is really one of the only genres that tends to get away with having over 120,000 words. And when you have a book that long, you really are demanding just so much commitment from the reader. And that might be fine if you're pretty famous already or you're pretty well known, but that's not so easy for debut authors. If you're a brand new author and this is your first book, you're going to have a really hard time getting someone to pick it up if it's extremely lengthy. That's not me saying you shouldn't do that. I'm just saying it's something to consider. I should probably mention some of my favorite fantasy series. God knows I've read a lot over my life, but some of the ones that have really stuck with me, like obviously the Middle-earth series. Name of the Wind. I did really enjoy the Nevernight series, although I haven't finished the last book yet. My favorite one from my childhood, and behind The Hobbit, the one that really solidified my love for fantasy, was Del Toro Quest by Emily Rodda. I haven't read it in like a million years, of course, and maybe I'm just remembering it with a fond bias, but I really do think that series could stand the test of time. I think it would even be worth going back and rereading them possibly, or reading them for the first time even if you're already an adult. Something that might surprise you, despite the absolute channel boner that I have for the King family, I actually really didn't like Stephen King's dabbling in the fantasy genre, the Dark Tower series. I only read the first book, but I just think it was one of the most monotonous, dragging, I just couldn't get into it. I just didn't like it. And something I've noticed from a lot of the people who did like it is that they were pre-existing Stephen King fans, and I think that might have something to do with the fact that the Dark Tower series has a lot of Easter eggs and is meant to be the story that kind of reveals and binds together all of the different Stephen King books and shows that they exist within a Stephen King multiverse. I'm not saying that's always the case, but I think that is a pretty strong reason for a lot of people as to why they would have enjoyed it. On a side note, I think it's really cool that fantasy is coming back in a pretty big way on television. Like just some of the fantasy shows that we've got coming out in the future, near and far, are the Game of Thrones spin-off. We've got The Witcher, which is based on a really old book series, but probably more fondly known for the just extraordinary video game. Then, of course, the one I'm most excited for is the Middle-earth TV show coming out on Amazon Prime. I think that's going to be just... So there's a certain branch of fantasy called urban fantasy, and that was the first, full books that I finished writing were an urban fantasy series. To clarify, urban fantasy being a fantasy series set in parallel with the real world. Most popular example, of course, is Harry Potter. The real world exists as we know it, but the fantasy or magical world kind of exists behind the scenes or as a secret, or perhaps as a future version of our world. And writing urban fantasy had quite a lot of challenges, but the one that really did a number on me was having to pretend like guns don't exist, which you would think would be easy for an Australian. I mean, imagine the Harry Potter universe if we took into account that guns are a thing. Imagine the final battle of Hogwarts if they'd rigged the grounds with landmines and if Neville had walked out with a rocket launcher. The name's Longbottom, punk bitch. And you know what? I don't give a fuck what you try to tell me, alright? Harry couldn't Expelliarmus himself out of the way of a sniper bullet. And of course the way to go is usually a magical explainer, although that itself is pretty difficult to say. Okay, bullets and guns won't kill this person, but an arrow will. And it's fine to do that because that's almost the only way to actually explain away guns, but then you also have the challenge of making it not sound like you're making excuses. If it's too convenient, it might just be worse than including guns anyway. My favorite thing about fantasy, and I think the strongest trait of a fantasy story, the thing that really brings it home for fantasy, and to be fair, it's probably the defining feature of a fantasy story, is world building. That's just something that no other genre can do to that level. Kind of in parallel with that is just how fantastic I think it is that the mark of a fantasy is the hero's journey. I did a video on that, kind of like the story structure that applies to almost every fantasy story. And I'm going to oversimplify here, but that's that we're taken on a quest with a character where they start with the status quo, they go through some trials, they achieve something or a reward from those trials, and those achievements and reward help them to overcome the conflict, and then they return to the status quo in which it has usually been repaired or fixed. And I think it's fantastic that we get taken on this quest, this journey, see these trials take place over such a shifting and changing landscape. It's usually only a fantasy where you'll read about the hero fighting a monster in the desert in one chapter, and then climbing snowy mountains in another. Seeing the setting change around the challenges really helps to make it feel like it is different challenges that they're facing. I want to keep chatting about that particular point in a second, but I just want to mention really quick, can we talk about how hilarious it is that someone actually walked into the room, sat down at the table, and made the decision for orcs to be Cockney?
Oi, you right, mate. I've been chasing these hairy short little fellas and I'm absolutely knackered.
So yeah, world building, like a lot of other fantasy fans, I'm sure, that's my favorite thing about fantasy, and that's what I'm usually looking for when I read a fantasy is good world building. That's one of the things at the top of the checklist. But another thing is also the challenges or the trials. This is really important, and you should listen up if you are a writer writing fantasy. I've read quite a few bad and fantastic fantasy stories where the trials and challenges are almost always the same. They're just repackaged with a different creature or monster. Most cases, it's always just a challenge of brute strength or combat skill. This is something I think I've done before, but it's also a wasted opportunity, and it's something I've started to notice more when I read a lot more fantasy stories. And that is that the real beauty of these challenges and trials is seeing how they're approached differently every single time. If the challenge demands something different from the heroes, then they're required to step outside of just rehashing a victory they had a chapter ago. Rather than just using their magical swords to beat the bad guys again, they have to come at it a different way this time. Specifically, a really fantastic way I've seen this done as well is when the writer uses this as an opportunity to showcase the different characters' skills. Like, obviously don't be too on the nose about it, otherwise it'll start feeling like a middle grade fantasy, but if every challenge requires a different approach, it can be improved by that approach being a different character's solution every time. To use a really simple but popular example of this, let's say the Sorcerer's Stone, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. After passing Fluffy the three-headed dog, there's a series of challenges, and they are each equipped to handle these challenges in their own special ways. For example, Hermione knows how to get past the, murderous plant. Ron's knowledge of Wizard's Chess gets him past another one of the trials, and then obviously Harry's Quidditch skills help him to catch the flying keys on the broomsticks. It all just helps to build the feeling that these characters aren't just there for the sake of being there. They aren't just props. They had a purpose in the story. By the end, when they win and they save the day, it's always better if there's an understanding that they couldn't have done that if not for every single character that's there. One thing I hate that unfortunately seems to be just rampant among fantasy writers is when they have their head really far up their own arse. You know, they create a big magical world, they create a language, they do all this truly fantastic stuff, and then they end up in a circle jerk with themselves. I also hate when that circle jerk attitude manages to make its way into the actual writing itself. What do I mean by that? Don't worry, I'll tell you, my dude. I always find it a little bit pretentious if a story is jam-packed with just way too many world-building, class, and political elements. It's not even mentioning when they have a full theatre cast of characters and half of them have incredibly similar-sounding names. But they think by burying the reader with all of this stuff and basically putting the reader in a situation where they feel like they have to research the fucking story that they're reading. The author thinks if they do this, if they manage to confuse the reader a little bit, well, it makes them really smart. And don't get it twisted, that's not me saying, complexity doesn't belong in fantasy. I just don't think we should pretend that there isn't a line. There isn't such thing as too much. Like, yeah, you created a third political subplot. Congratulations, bro. Quit whacking off and just chill out. A good example of this, although I think the author of this book wasn't really trying to make any pretentious statement, I think the author actually just wanted to experiment a bit more with the fantasy structure and it just didn't turn out well. And yet a lot of the audience still has the attitude of, well, if you don't get it, then you're just not smart enough. Like, fuck off. Anyway, I'm talking about Marlon James's book, Black Leopard, Red Wolf. Just way too convoluted. Yeah. I had a ton of problems with that book, and you can check out my full review of it. But just a couple of the problems I had were the decision to make the story almost completely non-linear. There were so many flashbacks and fucking shifting around. It was very easy to lose where you actually were in the narrative. And that was only made a lot more difficult by the hot potatoing that was going on with all of these different characters. Basically, characters coming in for a few pages, us getting their life story, and then them dipping out and never to be seen again. There's also Grimdark, which is another subgenre of fantasy. I won't say a whole lot about this one because, to my knowledge, I've only ever read one Grimdark book. That would be Godblind by Anna Stevens. And you know what? I really enjoyed it. It was really good. Yay! Obviously not for kids. It's a lot more gory, a lot more dark. But I do like that the stakes feel just a whole lot higher, and there really is a very real chance and risk of catastrophic failure. It's a lot more likely in Grimdark to see main character deaths, and that just makes it a bit more suspenseful, a bit more exciting. Grimdark's good if you're feeling particularly nihilistic. Grimdark is basically fantasy for goths. Fantasy as a whole is one of the genres that I think it feels like it must be tapped dry at this point, right? Like it's just so done that you would think all of the fantasy stories that could be told have been told. But when you think about it, fantasy more than any other genre has a lot more potential for experimentation. There's just still a whole lot more potential for different spins and takes and twists and mechanics to a fantasy story. I just don't think it's going to be tapped out in my lifetime or yours. Anyway, that's basically all the feelings I have about the fantasy genre right now. Thanks for watching. If you subscribe to my channel, you get the right to stand over me while I sleep and whisper discouraging things.
You'll never be able to grow a beard.
Oh, catcha.
She's got class and style, street knowledge by the pound, yeah. Baby never act wild, very low key on the profile. Catching feelings isn't all. Let me show you how it goes. Herbs the word, spins the verb.